Hello, my name is Camille Campbell, and I'm here with my colleagues Joe Ranney and Javier Solis. And today we are going to talk about the values of our universal switches if you're a customer that's running one of our Ethernet routing switches or one of our older EXOS series of switches at the edge of your network. So just in terms of what we're going to cover some of the life cycle considerations around some of these aging switches. We're going to talk a bit about what the migration path options are, and we're really going to be specific around some of the features and functionality from a hardware, a software, and a management perspective that you can take advantage of as you migrate to a universal switch. So to kick things off, just a little bit of an introduction to our universal switches. And we do have two series of products. We have our 5520, which is our mid-tier series of switches. And we also have our 5420, our value series of switches. And what Universal really does is it really combines the power of cloud-based networking with next generation multi-use case platforms. So multi-use case really means that these switches are capable of running either our EXOS operating system or our VOS operating system, depending on the deployment model you want to follow at the network edge. In addition, Universal is much more than just about the platforms. It's really about simplifying that end-to-end deployment experience. So we've streamlined and simplified how we order and procure the products. We've simplified how we do licensing and made it a lot more flexible. We've also brought in a consistent warranty offer across our wired and wireless infrastructure, which is then complemented by top-ranked services and support. And it's really this combination of technologies that enables us to deliver scalable, distributed, enterprise-grade connectivity to support Extreme's vision of the infinite enterprise. So universal switches really represent an evolution of our Ethernet routing switch technology. And these have had just a vast history. We've brought about a lot of innovation with this switch portfolio. Many of you may have even been with us since the Bay Stack days. But we were one of the first vendors to come up with active-active networking with SMLT. We had a lot of innovations in our stacking. And then just in terms of how you may have deployed these products at the edge, you may have deployed stacking with either Fabric Attach or Fabric Connect, homed into a VSP aggregation layer. And we're going to revisit this architecture as we move through the presentation. So in terms of some of the reasons why you might want to look at refreshing your edge, well, we were at an inflection point with wireless. So you might be deploying some Wi-Fi 6 APs and want to connect via multi-rate and also add additional power capabilities. Many of you are likely experiencing an influx of connected things connecting into your network, and whether it's intelligent lighting systems, whether it's some of these sophisticated IP cameras, or whether it's medical devices. Again, you may just need to provide scalable, reliable connectivity for these various things. Another reason may be to enhance security. The network edge, of course, is so critical. So looking at things like max set capabilities, policy, end-to-end segmentation that can go right down to the network edge. Or you might just be wanting to take advantage of a longer support cycle. So you can see here on the slide, the lifecycle status of our various Ethernet routing switch product families. And for any of you who are running 4500s, 5500s, 5600s, we do have an end of service life date quickly approaching at the end of the year. Just to preempt any questions you guys might have on the lifecycle status around 3600s, 4900s, and 5900s, we have not yet announced any plans for end of selling those products. And when we do announce, we will give you 6 months to purchase those products. If you're looking to take advantage of a more modern feature set and those higher speeds and higher performances, the recommended transition paths are here on this slide. So in areas of the network where you might have Ethernet routing switch 5000 series, you would transition to a 5520. 4000s would transition to a 5420. And for ERS 3000s, you can transition those to X435 series of switches, or you can wait for a future universal switch series. As you do migrate, you would get to take advantage of more modern hardware that's going to deliver higher speeds and higher performances. So you can take advantage of multi-rate, you can take advantage of higher speed uplinks. And one of the things that's unique about our universal switches is just the high power budget that they support. So again, providing power for those APs and connected devices. We also have integrated stacking. So you don't have to go out and purchase an external stack kit, similar to how we've done stacking in the past with the ERS and EXOS products. And we've also added fiber aggregation models to our universal switch portfolios. Universal switches also represent a great refresh option for those of you who are running some of the older EXOS series of switches. And again, these switches have a vast history as well, with multiple generations of these products now. So you can see some of the first generation of products and when they achieve end of service life. So keep your eye on the end of next year. And again, similar to the ERS side, on the EXOS side, we have not announced end of sale yet for any of the second generation platforms. So the X460s, X450s, and X440G2 series of products, we have not announced an end of sale. However, if you are looking for those modern feature sets, if you are looking for speed and performance, we have mapped out the transition paths to the Universal Switch series, as you can see on the slide. And then just in terms of some of the hardware advantages, you see many of the same advantages. Multi-rate, higher speed uplinks, that high power budget, and of course the fiber aggregation models as well. And with that, I wanted to turn things over to Joe, who's going to walk through some of the migration options. So over to you, Joe.
All right, thank you, Camille. You're spot on. We want to provide our customers with choice. And it doesn't matter if they come from an EXOS background or an ERS background. They want to move forward with traditional stacking or try this new fabric to the edge capability. We can provide our customers choice and flexibility. The name of the game is automation. And the way that we automate with fabric to the edge will reduce up to 90% of the provisioning tasks. So you do not have to provision VLANs or MLAGs or ACLs or even fabric attach with the automation that we introduce with this new fabric to the edge capability. So it provides a more consistent and simple approach to the edge stacking configuration. And if you think back to when stacking was first envisioned back in the late 90s, the idea was to reduce the amount of configuration at the edge of the network with a single management IP address. We're accomplishing a similar task today, but eliminating the automation or eliminating the provisioning of VLANs, MLAGs, and ACLs. And the way that we do this is with this new Autosense port capability. And with a VOS 8.3 switch, all the ports are Autosense enabled by default, and the port state will change depending on the device that you plug into that port. So if you're plugging in a new VOS switch into a already configured VOS switch, and it's an NNI link, the new switch will now receive a Fabric Connect configuration, and that NNI link will be auto-provisioned. If it's a device with Fabric Attach running, such as an ERS switch or an EXOS switch or one of our access points, that port state will change to an FA server port. And the same is true when end users plug in. The end user device will be auto-detected, and if it's a NEAP or EAP configuration, then that configuration, that switch port will be auto-provisioned for the user and the device that is plugging into that port. Same thing with a phone, and if Radius is not configured on those ports, then we will onboard the devices into a guest VLAN. So if we take a look back at the architecture, and what you can see on this slide is I have 3 devices that are in my aggregation layer, and then I have a series of IDFs, and you can see that I'm using the same connection, the same technology to connect all the devices together. In this case, it's Fabric Connect, and I'm using network-to-network interfaces. On the back end, I may have Extreme Management Center or Cloud IQ and Radius provisioned to talk to the devices as they plug into these edge ports. but there's no manual provisioning of these uplinks or the ports themselves. We can also automate the configuration of multicast out at the edge as well. Only at the aggregation node do you need to do this. And then finally, tying this into the Extreme Management Center and site engine configuration that I mentioned earlier, we can automate the delivery of VLANs to the end user ports. So what are some of the advantages of this technology? You heard me mention that in the late 90s, when stacking was first envisioned, the idea was to reduce the configuration at the edge of the network. Now with this technology, we're accomplishing a similar goal, but we're doing it in a different manner. So what you can see on this slide is I have 6 switches connected together in an IDF using high-speed ports. I simply connect unit 1 to unit 2, unit 2 to unit 3, so on and so forth. And then I have a return cable to go from the bottom unit to the top unit in the stack. I also have redundant uplinks provisions. In this case, I have unit 1 and unit 4 have a redundant uplink. And then of course, in my core switches, those are connected as well. And I'm using Fabric Connect technology everywhere in this design. So I have a consistent experience with this technology. I automate the delivery of VLANs to the edge ports. And I also have topology independence. The only downside to this technology is you have an IP address on every node to configure each node. But I also see that as an advantage because I have independent stacking control architecture, meaning if unit 3 were to, CPU was to exceed or hit 100%, it would not disrupt the other switches in the stack, which is possible with traditional stacking technology. In this case, unit 3 would be isolated. The remaining units in the stack would continue to operate without issue. With that, I will hand it over to Javier to continue with a traditional stacking approach.
Thanks, Joe. So as Joe said, I'm going to be talking about some of the traditional stacking capabilities, but pivoting over to our EXOS platform. So with universal hardware, as Camille mentioned and Joe had mentioned, is that we give you the flexibility to choose which operating system that you're going to pivot towards based on the features and functionality that you need. So in the case that your topology still calls out for stacking, you can pivot over to EXOS and build a stack of up to 8 switches within that stack configuration. So again, we kind of pivot to a different type of topology and methodology where you are able to configure up to 8 switches within that stack from one management IP. And you do have the option to scale your uplinks down to, as you can see here, an MLAG or SMLT configuration. We also offer comprehensive policy configuration that gives us the ability to provide additional control mechanisms around the devices that are attached to our EXOS switches and or stacks, which we'll be going over. We can also run fabric attached technology as well with EXOS. So if you decide to use EXOS at the edge, you can still use VOS and other parts of your network to build out your Fabric Connect environment and take your EXOS edge and use fabric attached to connect up into your fabric. And then we also offer some multimedia synchronization feature sets as well within EXOS. So let's just take a quick look of how EXOS can help you build out advanced access controls using what we call EXOS One Policy. And basically what One Policy and EXOS allows us to do is create roles with multiple rules associated to each of those roles. So in the diagram, you can see here that we have contractor, employee, and guests, as well as phone, APs, and other devices. And so we can create a role that can be assigned to those particular sets of devices and or users. We can then configure layer 2, 3, 4, or layer 7 rules that can allow or deny access for those users and or devices. So you can see here that we, as an example, the contractors and guests have access to the internet, but we've created a role with a rule that blocks access to our database systems. And another example, you can see where we have 2 phones, where we've created a phone role and we've allowed the phones to intercommunicate with each other, but the phones do not have access to connect directly to the internet. So again, you can create flexible roles and rules depending on not just the users, but the types of devices that you're managing as well. We also have the ability to provide flexible configuration for how we deploy our roles and rules. We can use a traditional approach where we match most specific rule first, or we can pivot to a top-down access list style of matching for our rules. When you go into the access list style, you will increase the capability of how many rules that you can define per each role. We also have the ability to, again, provide different ways on how you can deploy one policy. So one way is simply just once you create your roles and your rules, you can statically assign that role to a switch port. So as your devices are connected, and if you have limited access to your networking closets, then you can keep a static assigned role. However, we also do support the ability to dynamically assign the roles when you combine the solution with our Extreme Networks Access Control solutions via 802.1x and MAC authentication. So moving on. So we did want to touch on some of the additional capabilities that we have with our universal switches, running EXOS and automating part of the stack. So as Joe said, it's all about automation. And so that's true as well when using EXOS and stacking. So the universal hardware switches will all support the ability to form a stack using the push button. So here in the example, you can see that we have up to 8 switches all interconnected with our stack cable. You can then power up all those switches, go to the top switch and toggle the mode button to the STK LED. Once you're there, you can hold the mode button down for 5 seconds and then release it. At that point, stacking will then be enabled on that switch, as well as auto-detected that enable stacking has been performed for the other switches connected as well. All the switches will reboot and come up, and you'll have a formed stack without having to go in and performing any CLI configuration. Once you do that, we can take advantage of our zero-touch provisioning processes where the stack will be able to auto-detect if there's a DHCP server on the uplink that's plugged into the stack. Once we do that, we can then onboard our stack to Extreme Cloud IQ and or Extreme Cloud IQ site engine. And then we also have the ability to automatically replace a failed node. So in this example, our slot at the very bottom is failed. We can take a like model SKU and replace that failed node. When we do so, we can configure and synchronize that switch into the stack automatically without you having to go in and perform additional configuration to get that new switch replaced for the failed unit. So as you can see, we have tons of feature sets that you can pivot to when you're looking at migrating from your older ERS platforms or your older EXOS Gen 1 or Gen 2 platforms as we bring in our universal hardware with the 5520 and 5420 switches. So you can again choose to run VOS and leverage Fabric Connect, Extend, and Multicast, or you can pivot over to EXOS and take advantage of stacking and policy along with Fabric attach capabilities. And we also support, again, audio video bridging functions within EXOS as well. So with all that said, I'm going to hand it back over to Camille, and she's going to be talking about some of our software management options for our universal hardware platforms.
Thanks, Javier. So from a centralized management perspective, one thing about our universal switches is they have been integrated into all of our various centralized management tools. So starting with the Extreme Management Center, we have done full integration of the 5520 and the 5420 into that platform. But as you guys have heard from this conference, the recommended transition is to the Extreme Cloud IQ site engine. And of course, that gives you extra feature velocity, and it also gives you that optional ability to connect into Extreme Cloud IQ to take advantage of some of the visualization and some of the AI ML driven analytics provided by that platform. The other thing that makes the universal switches unique is the fact that they're considered cloud native devices. So what that means is from day one, these switches have had Cloud IQ support. So what that means is that you get to take advantage of a bunch of additional functionality. So with the universal platforms, we are offering a 1-year free subscription to our Cloud IQ platform. And this will allow you to really start playing around with the functionality provided by our cloud-based management platform. In addition, I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that we've done a lot to simplify and provide added flexibility with how we do Switch OS feature licenses. So we have unified our Switch licenses across EXOS and BOSS. And more importantly, to activate those licenses, you can do that very easily through Extreme Cloud IQ. And we're also offering license portability through Extreme Cloud IQ as well. So you can transfer a Premier license from one switch to another within the Universal family. And then the other major advantage of the Universal platforms is our warranty offer. So in addition to hardware RMAs for the lifetime of the product, we're also offering lifetime software updates and upgrades as well. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to point out on this slide is for any of you running Ethernet routing switches today, and if you're taking advantage of the Enterprise Device Manager, that does also carry forward to the universal platforms with the BOSS operating system enabled. So Joe talked about all of the strengths of running Fabric to the edge and all the automation that you get. And Javier talked about all of the great stacking capabilities and policy that you can get with the EXOS operating system. And really just to summarize and talk about some of the key considerations you may want to think about as you're making your decision as to which migration path to go down. So the first would be just the level of automation that's desirable at your network edge. And Joe talked a lot about all the automation that we're enabling through the Autosense capabilities. And so if you are in a dynamic network environment, experiencing a lot of network moves, adds, and changes, that solution does provide a lot of automation. In addition, network access control is very, very important in any edge infrastructure that you might be deploying. Many of you have deployed it for wireless, but it is equally important on the wired side. So, we've talked about some of the dynamic service provisioning that you can get from network access control, but the security benefits are equally as important. So operational consistency is, again, another key consideration. And if you're utilizing more of a device by device CLI or EDM type approach, having one OS end to end might make more sense. But if you started to upgrade and migrate to our centralized management tools, that may be less of a consideration, and you can take advantage of bulk configuration templates through Extreme Cloud IQ Site Engine or XMC. And then topology. So one of the benefits that Joe mentioned is if you push Fabric Connect right to the edge, that just gives you a lot of freedom to design your network edge however you want to design it. You have that complete flexibility from a physical topology perspective. Scale is another thing to think about. Many of you, as you push Fabric Connect right to the edge, might be worried about some of the scaling limitations with Fabric Connect and going past that 500 node limitation. And what I would say here is please do check out Roger Lapou's multi-area presentation. Multi-area is a feature coming in June, and it's going to allow you to scale your networks well beyond that 500 node limitation. Failure domain. So Joe talked a lot about this, and it really, depends on what endpoints you have hanging off your switch or your stack. And, having a Fabric Edge, managing each switch independently can limit the failure domain. But again, you're managing the switches with their own IP address. So there's definitely some pros and cons to think about. And then, of course, the level of sophistication that you're looking at from a policy perspective. And Javier talked about all of the great policy capabilities that we have within EXOS, including the availability of layer 7 application filtering. And this slide really gets into a little bit more details in terms of configuring various activities at the edge switches and how each solution compares. So as Joe talked about, we've come out with Autosense capabilities as part of VOS 8.3. And although you may still have to enable a few things globally on your switch, what you're doing is we're basically eliminating a lot of the per port configuration on the VOS side. Equally, on the EXOS side, Javier talked about a lot of the automation that is being built into the stacking solution there. And also, of course, you can automate using fabric attach and adding to that network access control as well. And if we go back to our first slide where we showed your existing architecture, where you could have some ERSs with fabric attach and ERSs running Fabric Connect, single or dual homed into a VSP aggregation, you can absolutely expand and deploy new wiring closets using our universal switches, whether it's configured with EXOS, whether it's configured with VOS, and home those into the exact same VSP aggregation. So again, the idea here is we're offering you flexibility, we're offering you choice, but we're ensuring everything is compatible and works seamlessly together. And with that, that really concludes today's session. I wanted to thank you guys for joining us today, and we hope you have a great rest of the show.